Yeah, thanks. I want to be very brief because I think the important part of this is to hear what people's views are rather than just to hear views from here. But I have two roles. One is, of course, I'm the MSP for Argyll and Bute, Brennan's Scottish Parliament counterpart. I've dealt with many of you in that regard, taken up issues and been involved in problems that you've had. The second role I have is the Scottish Government's Cabinet Secretary for Government, Business and Constitutional Relations, which is a grand title. It simply means I am the Scottish Government's negotiator on Brexit. I've been a member of the negotiating structure for the last 2.5 years, which is why I'm looking increasingly aged and coming to the end of my shelf life, I have to say. But it's in that regard I just want to touch on some key issues. I want to touch on 3 key issues. The first of which is the Fisheries Bill, the UK Fisheries Bill, which I actually think is the least problematic part of this. The second one is the possible outcomes and how they may affect you. And the third one is essentially where we go from here. In terms of the UK Fisheries Bill, I have been engaged in trying to find agreement with the UK on all the subjects that are covered by the negotiations and by Brexit. And as Fergus indicated, actually 2 years ago, we put on the table a compromise which would have fulfilled the requirement that many of you and your colleagues had to leave the common fisheries policy, but would have maintained and could maintain the single market and the customs union. And therefore it would have the advantages of leaving the CFP, for those who think that is an advantage, so I think there is a debate to be had about that, but it would also have had the advantages of meaning the product could have gone into and could go into Europe and backwards and forwards without additional tariffs and without additional difficulties. Now that was on the table 2 years ago. It's very interesting that it's still being discussed in the sense that is what the Norway or Norway Plus option is that you hear about. And it's still not an impossibility. It's available to the UK should they wish it. There's only one major barrier, and that is the red lines that the UK government set itself, and particularly the red line on migration. Prime Minister is probably the strongest advocate against migration in the whole of the Cabinet. And in fact, that's a fixation on migration. Every time you talk to her, the conversation ends up on migration and how you have to stop migration. And with that red line, there isn't any possibility of being in the single market. Because to be in the single market, a member of the European Economic Area, you have to accept freedom of movement. Freedom of movement is vitally important for Scotland. 223,000 EU citizens in Scotland. You could argue whether or not that's a good thing to be dependent on it, but it's just a fact. 223,000. In the Highlands and Islands, 20% of the workforce will retire within the next 10 years, and that means we will be 80,000 people short in the workforce in the Highlands and Islands within 10 years, with no natural population growth. You and I are not breeding enough. We're not producing people to replace people for jobs. So in these circumstances, if freedom of movement is rejected, we won't be able to be in the single market, and we will have, frankly, an economic crisis right across sectors in Scotland. So, that having been said, the Fisheries Bill isn't a major obstacle to an agreement. Actually, the relationships that exist between officials north and south have been particularly good. We have much harder issues to resolve. Agriculture actually is a much harder issue to resolve than fisheries. But that could be a matter of an agreement between Scotland and the rest of the UK comparatively easily. But it would have to depend on the 4 possible outcomes that now exist. And there are essentially only 4 ways this can go. I'm never entirely sure of that because this has been so confusing over the last 2.5 years. But my view is there are only 4 possible outcomes. The first outcome is a no Brexit. That is as a result of a referendum or some other means Brexit doesn't take place. I don't think that's likely, but I still think it's on the table. There isn't a majority for it in the House of Commons, but there probably is a very substantial amount of support for it. The second outcome is what I've just described to you, which is the Norway Plus option. And the Norway Plus option, that is membership of the Single Market and Customs Union, or the Single Market. You might not be in the Customs Union, which is where Norway is. And Norway, of course, has tariffs on fish and seafood products as a result of that. But you would certainly be in a better position than you would be on the third option, which is the Prime Minister's deal. The Prime Minister's deal is uniquely bad because it actually has had to follow all her red lines. So in actual fact, lots of things that would have been possible aren't possible. When the EU says this is the only possible outcome, they mean it's the only outcome because of the things she wanted to get out of it. as a result of which it's bad for this sector, because it's got issues in terms of labour, it's got issues in terms of tariffs, but it's actually very bad for aquaculture, which was a total surprise. Nobody expected her to bring aquaculture into the negotiations and to put it in there as essentially something to be traded away. So it's uniquely bad. But it's only marginally worse to think of the worst possible option, and that is no deal at all. There are people who are going around saying the no deal will be fine. There are countries in the world that aren't members of the EU and they survive fine. There's only one country in the world that isn't a member of some sort of free trade bloc, and that is Mauritania. I know nothing about Mauritania, but I don't want to know about Mauritania because I suspect I don't need to know. Just to say, if there's only one country in the world that isn't part of a free trade bloc, then there's a problem. And if you're out on WTO rules, there's some sort of wonderful thing about the words WTO. It sounds wonderful and it will work well. The WTO is a rules-based trading association that essentially exists to police trade. There's no more than that. But it's tremendously complicated and bureaucratic. The amount of regulation in it is enormous, and it's hard to change those regulations. It also means dealing with 164 other countries about how you're going to trade. Not just 27, but 164. And that's going to be difficult. So, of those four, my own preference is no Brexit, of course. I've been a lifelong pro-European. But if we have to have a compromise we offered 2 years ago of single market customs union membership on the Norway model is the best one for Scotland and for the sector and for a range of other sectors. And it's still possible to get to that. But it requires the Prime Minister particularly to accept that she is going to have to drop one or two of those red lines. And I think that that is unlikely. So where do we go from here? Essentially, for the last 3 months I've been saying we'll know next week. And I'm going to say it again now, we will know next week. Or at least we will know next week if any of the options can get a majority in the House of Commons. I'm in the process of writing to every MP, not just the Scottish ones, but everyone to lay out what the Scottish Government's options are and preferences are, but we will know next week what the House of Commons has chosen to do. If, as I expect, there is no majority for the Prime Minister's deal, then we are no further forward. And that's very difficult for everyone. I want a secure outcome of this and a resolution of this as much as anybody else, perhaps almost more than anybody else. We want some security and some safety in this, so we know where we're going to go. But if there is no decision next week, then that doesn't happen. And the likelihood of moving to a no deal becomes greater. And I just want to finish by saying a word or two about no deal, because I would be particularly interested in views on this as the day goes on. The Scottish Government does not want a no deal. Our analysis is that it will be very, very difficult. But nonetheless, we have to prepare for it. We have set up a series of structures to prepare for it. I am deeply involved in no deal planning. The Scottish Government's equivalent of the UK COBRA system, the emergency system, is SCORE, the Scottish Government's resilience operation. That is now activated. It is meeting on a weekly basis. I was at a meeting of it yesterday afternoon. It involves not only all the departments of the Scottish Government, and Fergus is involved in it too. It involves all the responders, it involves the police. It is a big operation, and it's there. And one of the things it has to look at is what happens to primary producers. People like yourselves who are producing something which may not be able to get to market. How do we deal with that? Are there other markets that could open up in Scotland or the rest of the UK quickly? If there aren't those markets, are there places that that product can go? Can it go into a system? It can't be stored indefinitely, but can it go into a system, for example, in terms of hospitals or prisons or school meals, that could in actual fact, for a limited period of time, absorb a product. I find it utterly incredible that I'm spending a good 50–60% of my time thinking about such things, thinking about supply chains, for example. You know, the pressure of the supply chain and what's happening at Dover, it is difficult to see how that can be overcome. This great mythical ferry company with no ferries is part of a process to try and overcome it by the UK. But even if all those contracts are honoured that the UK government has set, it will only increase capacity by under 3%. It will in actual fact be a very limited input. And we have the whole issue of importation, for example, of drugs and veterinary medicines, which are absolutely vital, which will have to take precedence over everything other than basic foodstuffs. So there are huge supply chain issues, and in any supply chain, those furthest from the market are those who suffer most, and that actually means the west and north of Scotland, which is furthest from the market. So, but whatever the Scottish Government can do in those circumstances, it will do and is doing. And that will mean engaging with this organisation and with other organisations to coordinate that activity if it should be required. Do I think it will be required? No, actually I don't. I still think that at the end of the day, the House of Commons particularly will not support no deal. But it is a measure of the difficulty that now exists that we are spending a very substantial time and effort looking at it, and that includes looking at what would happen to this sector and to other sectors that are primary producers of foodstuffs. Finally, the best outcome of this is to essentially step away from the precipice, to find a solution, even if it's a temporary solution for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and that would be the single market customs unions. And the British government will go on supporting that. Its second choice in these circumstances is the second referendum. You know, there is a sense in which that's anti-democratic, not just as the border might argue, but in Scotland too, because we've already voted against it, and very substantially. But it would be better than continuing this uncertainty, which is not only damaging us, and it is damaging us, it is damaging our relationships further afield. I'm in Ireland next week, I'm in Brussels the following week, and there is a sense of despair that this should happen, and the sense that it changes the whole set of relationships in the long term. I look forward to hearing what people have to say this afternoon, and those of you who I deal with on a regular basis, I always say I'm entirely open to you coming to me directly if you have concerns that you have in our gallery, and I will endeavour to address them and deal with them if I possibly can. Thank you.